Hello, my name is Leonardo Desideri. I am an independent researcher from Brazil, and it's a pleasure to be part of this conference. Today I'll share key findings from my literature review on public trust in fact-checking. Fact-checking has become one of the main tools to address disinformation, but its effectiveness depends not only on verification methods, it also depends on whether audiences actually trust the organizations behind those corrections. Researchers have examined how political identity, psychological dynamics, and communication strategies interact to shape that trust. Surveys and experiments reveal a complex landscape. In the United States, a Pew Research Center study showed that the public is almost evenly split. About half of Americans think fact-checkers treat all sides fairly, while the other half believe they favor one side. In Australia, Carson and colleagues ran a large survey experiment during an election and found overall high trust in fact-checkers. Cross-national experiments conducted simultaneously in Argentina, Nigeria, South Africa, and the UK showed that fact checks consistently reduced belief in falsehoods across very different cultural contexts. These studies together suggest that trust is highly context dependent, but a baseline openness to factual corrections exists in many places. A major pattern in the literature is political polarization. In the US, Pew's data show a striking partisan divide. Martel and Rand's 2024 study confirms that conservatives are more skeptical of fact-checkers than liberals. And interestingly, among conservatives, higher knowledge of how news works correlates with greater distrust. Earlier work by Brandstad and Fostad observed that people often ignore facts that challenge their view, and over time, this defensive posture can evolve into generalized distrust of the fact-checker. Now let's turn to a crucial dimension: perceived bias and the question of neutrality. This is one of the most consistently cited reasons for distrust. Brimig's 2023 study highlights that people's trust in fact-checkers depends heavily on whether they see these organizations as independent public service actors or as extensions of existing media and political institutions. When audiences believe fact-checkers play a neutral, journalistic role, their credibility increases, but when they are perceived as aligned with elites or power structures, skepticism rises sharply. This perception of bias is reinforced by inconsistencies in fact-checking practices themselves. Markowitz and colleagues analyzed how different major US outlets evaluated similar claims. They found notable discrepancies in both which claims were selected for checking and how severely they were rated. Lima and Choi conducted a large-scale quantitative study and found that about 30% of claims evaluated by two agencies received different verdicts. These discrepancies often emerge in ambiguous cases where interpretation plays a major role. But from the audience's point of view, they can look like proof that fact-checkers are subjective or politically motivated. Soprano explains that fact-checking is not immune to cognitive and editorial biases. Confirmation bias, evidence selection bias, and framing effects can all shape how fact-checkers interpret claims. Even if unintentional, editorial priorities, like checking some politicians more frequently than others, can produce patterns that resemble selective enforcement. Research also shows that perceived political closeness plays a role. Gia and Lee found that people's trust increases when they sense political alignment with the fact-checker and decreases when they sense misalignment. Media framing can intensify this. When fact-checks are labeled as coming from specific news outlets, audiences often transfer their pre-existing feelings about the outlet to the fact-check. In short, perceptions of bias and neutrality emerge from a mix of external factors like institutional trust and political identity, and internal factors like methodological differences, editorial choices, and occasional errors. This dual nature makes neutrality one of the most difficult challenges for fact-checkers to address. Finally, communication strategies also matter. Martel and Brand showed that warning labels reduce belief in falsehoods even among the skeptical users. Atherwood and colleagues found that community-driven contextual notes, such as those on Nexus community notes, increase perceived trustworthiness across political groups. Young and colleagues found that video fact-checking formats can increase attention and reduce misperceptions compared to text. Kim's research points to the importance of clarity and respectful tone. Interventions that sound condescending can alienate our audiences, while structured and transparent formats foster receptivity. In conclusion, public trust in fact-checking is shaped by a combination of political, psychological, and institutional forces, with perceived neutrality at the core of this dynamic. Trust is not static. It depends on sustained, transparent, and balanced practices that build it over time. Thank you very much for your attention.